Hi, this is Dr. Andrea Messing-Matthew with Education Systems Center, and this is the WIOA Youth Career Pathways Developing Logic Models webinar. I will be walking folks through the development of a logic model in preparation for the WIOA Notice of Funding Opportunity for Youth Career Pathways. And we will be spending some time today walking through this. Any questions can also be directed to me at amessingmathy@niu.edu. The purpose of this session is to introduce you to logic modeling, to describe how to develop a logic model, and to describe how the logic model will be used in partnership with your organizations in program planning and evaluation. So what is the logic model? A logic model really is a picture of your program. What are you putting into the program? What are you doing? What are you trying to achieve? It clarifies the strategy that underlies the program. It builds a common understanding, especially about the relationship between actions and results. It also communicates what your program is and is not about, which is important, and also does form the basis for evaluation. One thing that I want to really stress is that this is part of the ongoing learning cycle, and this is kind of a new avenue for the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity as they engage in this pilot process, not only a pilot process for career pathway system design at the local level, but also a pilot process in how program evaluation is actually conducted. So as we contemplate kind of this ongoing learning process that includes planning, data collection, analysis, and reflection, as well as action and implementation, there are some core questions that we really want to answer. First are, what are the long and short-term goals that we're trying to achieve? What are the inputs? What are you investing? What are the outputs? What are we actually doing? What are the external factors? What are some things that we just can't control? And what are some assumptions? What is there, some existing knowledge, some things that we already know? So if we contemplate the logic model as kind of a broader evaluation process, we have to think about evaluation as an ongoing learning cycle, a process that starts with planning, leads into data collection and analysis and reflection, and then on to action and improvement. Logic models are the foundation of planning and the core of any evaluation process. And as you make strategic decisions based on evaluation findings, you move right back into the planning stage. So stakeholder engagement is an important component of this because logic models offer an opportunity to engage stakeholders in a very different way. So the development of that logic model offers the opportunity to engage program stakeholders in a discussion about the program. They might include program staff, clients, service recipients, they might include partners, funders, board members, community representatives, and volunteers. And their perspectives can really enrich the program logic model by clarifying expectations for and about the program. The scope of the logic model should really identify a time frame for that logic model. The logic model structure really is that opportunity that's intended for program planning. You really want to define your parameters for your program clearly. So within the scope of the logic model, you really want to think about time frame and the logic model structure. So the time frame allows you to frame short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes and will make better decisions about resources and activities. So many groups design logic models for a funding or program cycle or a fiscal year or a time frame in which they believe they can achieve some meaningful results. So for the purposes of the planning for the Notice of Funding Opportunity, you really want to think about in that 12 to 18 month cycle, but also contemplate what some of the long-term outcomes will be beyond that. The logic model structure is also intended for program planning. So you really want to think about defining the parameters of your program clearly. So the logic model here, we really want to think about this in a series of components. So there's a components to this that really include the problem statement, the goal statement, the resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. So by resources, we're really talking about those inputs that are dedicated to or consumed by the program. Activities are those actions that the program takes to achieve those desired outcomes. So that's the how section, right? Then there's the why or so what section, and those are the outputs and the outcomes. Outputs are those measurable products of a program's activities, and outcomes are the benefits to clients, communities, systems, or organizations. Towards the end of this webinar, we'll break down the difference between outcomes and outputs. You really want to also think about this as a kind of an if-then relationship. This is a series of if-then relationships that really connect the components of the logic model. If resources are available to a program, then program activities can be implemented. If program activities are implemented successfully, then certain outputs and outcomes can be expected. So as you draft each component of the logic model, you want to consider if the if-then relationship between the components is accurate. If you can't make the connection between each component of the logic model, you should identify the gaps and adjust your work. This may mean revising some of your activities to ensure that you're able to achieve your outcomes, or revise intended outcomes to be feasible with available resources. So let's talk for a moment about the logic model's role in evaluation, but let's take a step back and also think about kind of what are the purposes of the logic model. The logic model is a really versatile tool that can support many different management activities. We really can think about this from a program planning perspective, from a program management perspective, from a communications perspective, consensus building, as well as for fundraising. So there's multiple rationales for why one would choose to use a logic model, and we can spend some time kind of digging through each component of that. So the cornerstone of effective evaluation is really that thorough understanding of the program you're trying to evaluate. What resources do we have to work with? What are we doing? What do we hope to achieve, and for whom and when? And so as we're contemplating an evaluation process for this known as a funding opportunity, the logic model really acts as the cornerstone of that evaluation process. When we conduct the evaluation, it can be very tempting to focus most of our attention on data collection, but the evaluation efforts will be much more effective if we start with a logic model, which is why we've done that with this model. We really want to think about how do we measure programs against what they themselves benchmark as the activities that they'd like to accomplish and the outcomes that they'd like to see come from those activities. So going through that logic model process will help to ensure that your evaluation will yield relevant and useful information. So this figure, I think, and this was presented at each of the technical assistance sessions, this figure below illustrates how the logic model you'll build will serve as that evaluation, that foundation for the evaluation in the future. So the logic model identifies those resources, those activities, those outputs, and those outcomes. Those activities, outputs, and data collection are part of the evaluation plan, the process part, right? Because outcomes are very difficult to measure in the short term. We really have a hard time, particularly for the types of programs that we're contemplating building, to think about any kind of real outcomes. Those outcomes come later. What we can measure is process. Are you doing what you said you were doing? And are you giving some of the outputs that you said you were going to do? So some of the components of the logic model step by step are these various components. The problem statement, the goal, rationales, assumptions, resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break each one down individually so that we can better understand how they all fit into the collective whole. So as we talk about the problem statement, we're really trying to say, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? What is the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why? So let's use an example of homeownership. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? So the example that I'm proposing is that many young people in our community do not own their home, so they do not experience the many financial and emotional benefits of home ownership. So perhaps they're renting, perhaps they're living with family, and that creates a tremendous amount of instability in the community. So what we're trying to think about is, how do we contemplate home ownership as a problem statement that we're trying to solve? Okay. The goal that we're contemplating is, what are we actually trying to accomplish? Goals should identify the intended results in general terms of a program and initiative, and they should specify the target population you intend to serve. Other terms for goal might be objective or long-term outcome, but I like the term goal. So an example for the homeownership component could be to increase the financial independence and security of young people in our community through home ownership. It's a really measurable type of goal. So all logic model components should be connected to your goal. If they're not, you should reassess. Having a clear goal helps to fight the temptation to implement an interesting program that just doesn't really fit. It's also tempting to have more than one goal, but we really try to recommend that you articulate one clear solution to your problem statement. Other goals of your program may be long-term outcomes rather than goals. You're really trying to think about what's the problem and what's the intended goal, the really core goal that you're trying to achieve. Phrase your goal in terms of the change you want to achieve over the life of your intervention, rather than a summary of the services that you're planning on providing. And don't make your statement so broad and general that it provides no guidance for your project. Really, we want to be able to benchmark against this goal. And so we're going to push organizations, even after they've completed their logic model, to kind of refine and rehone that particular goal. So the rationale, kind of the why question, right? These are the beliefs about how change occurs in your field and with your specific clients or audience based on your research, your experience, or your best practices, right? So for the example that we've set is that the rationale that we have for focusing on homeownership for young people is that homeownership increases a person's options for financial stability and for wealth building. Okay, so those rationale just all demonstrate a core set of beliefs based on knowledge about how change occurs in the field. The next thing that we want to talk about is assumptions, right? Assumptions, those are the things that underlie a program's theory, and these are conditions that are necessary for success and that you believe are true. The program needs those conditions in order to succeed, but you believe that those conditions already exist. They're not conditions that you need to bring about with your program activity. In fact, they're really not within your control. So those assumptions can refer to facts or special circumstances in your community, in your region, or your field. So an example for our home buying example is that there are houses for sale for which potential young home buyers will qualify. So this assumption demonstrates that there is a circumstance within the community that will enable a home buyer to successfully purchase a home. So understanding kind of some existing knowledge and existing conditions really helps us to make some decisions about kind of what activities and resources we need to achieve those. So let's talk about resources. Resources really help us to identify the available resources for our program. This helps us to determine the extent to which you'll be able to achieve and implement the program and achieve your intended goals and outcomes. You might also hear resources called inputs or program investments. So since this logic model is for a funding request, you want to think about all of the resources you'll need for a successful program, whether or not you have them in hand. There should potentially be a separate set of resources for have and a separate set of resources for need. These resources can be really bucketed in kind of several different types. Those are human, financial, space, technology, other equipment, and materials. So when we think about human resources, we think about kind of full and part-time staff, consultants, and those can be fundraising consultants, technical support, strategic planning, communications, pro bono staff services, volunteers, such as like what kind of human resources do you need? Then there's financial resources. Are those restricted grants, operating budgets, and other monetary resources? From a space perspective, you think about what is your office space required? What are other facilities that are required to make your program work? Technology could be computer hardware and software, communications infrastructure, email, website, things of that nature. Then there's other equipment such as office machinery and equipment specific to the program. And then office supplies, program materials, insurance, training materials, things of that nature count as materials. You really want to think about what do we have as materials? What do we still need to be successful? So you really want to think about the major resource categories for your program. And you want to be specific about those resources, but don't spend a lot of time developing a detailed list of all actual or anticipated program expenditures. For the purposes of this grant, and really as you think about how you might use logic models in the future, you really want to think kind of what are the bucketed categories of resources that we might need. So not specific enough would be home buying resources. That doesn't really tell us anything. But just right would be clear financial records. And those clear financial records as we'll articulate later, will be those W-2 forms, 1099s, tax returns, bank statements, etc. But we don't want to get that detailed in the logic model because it makes the logic model very unwieldy. So our activities are actions that are needed to implement the program. So what will you do with program resources in order to achieve program outcomes and ultimately your goals? So common activities are developing products. So those can be promotional materials or educational curriculum. It can be providing services, and that can be education and training, counseling, or health screening. It can be engaging in policy advocacy, and that could be issuing policy statements, conducting public testimony, etc., or building infrastructure, and that can be strengthening governance and management structures, relationships, and capacity. It's really helpful sometimes to think about grouping related activities together. So the number of activity groups depends on your program size, your plan, and how you plan to administer it. For a large program, there may be numerous activity groups. Smaller programs may consist of just one or two. Each activity group will have more specific activities under it, but remember, this is not a to-do list. Getting too specific will overwhelm your logic model and then overwhelm the stakeholder process that you spend a lot of time engaging in. So for the home buying example, we can use the activity groups of preliminary research, financial preparation, home buyers education, identifying neighborhoods, securing mortgage loans, choosing a home, and making the purchase. So you can you can use the activities you identify as an outline for a work plan, which is kind of what we're hoping that you're going to do as you think about the transition from a logic model to an action plan. So you use the activities as headings in a more comprehensive work plan that includes staff assignments and a timeline. Providing a complete list of activities helps people who are not familiar with your work understand what it really takes to implement it. But again, getting too specific can overwhelm the logic model. So there's some different ways that you can think about what level of specificity is useful. And I highly encourage everyone to look at innonet.org, so the Innovation Network, and their logic model workbook. And there's some really great activities there highlighted for how to actually frame activities on your logic model. So let's talk about outputs. Outputs are those measurable, tangible, and direct products or results of program activities. They lead to desired outcomes, and those can be benefits for participants, families, communities, or organizations, but they are not themselves the changes you expect the program will produce. They do help you assess how well you are implementing the program, however. Whenever possible, you should really think about expressing outputs in terms of the size and scope of services or products delivered or produced by the program. So those frequently include quantities or reflect the existence of something new. So some of the examples of program outputs will include numbers and descriptions using our example of a home buying process of, let's say, the number of home buying workshops attended, the number of neighborhoods researched, the number of program participants served, the number of hours of service provided, partnerships and coalitions formed, focus groups held, and or policy briefings conducted, right? An output statement doesn't reveal really anything about quality. You assess the quality of your outputs in your evaluation. So there's a few things to think about is that you want to make sure that those outputs have activities and resources that are associated with them. That's one way a logic model is truly useful. Really to think about whether a program has planned how it will create a product or deliver a service and to be able to check against that. People often identify specific numbers for their outputs. So thinking about an estimate based on experience, desired impact, or resources available is important. It's important not to get stuck on exact numbers because those can be adjusted later. A logic model is really a place for thinking about how are all the things I'm planning to do connected to things that I hope to get out of that. Which leads us to a discussion about outcomes. Outcomes really think about expressing the results that your program intends to achieve if implemented as planned. Outcomes are those changes that occur or the difference that is made for individuals, groups, families, organizations, systems, or communities during and after the program. Outcomes help answer the question, what difference does the program make? What does success look like? And they reflect the core achievements you hope for your program. Outcomes really should represent the results or impacts that occur because of a program activity or services. They should be within the scope of the program's control or sphere of reasonable influence, as well as within the time frame you've chosen for your logic model. It's crucial. They should also be general Generally accepted as valid by various stakeholders of the program. If an outcome is really deviating from kind of what you agreed to as stakeholders, that should tell you something about the connection that this program might have to your community. They should be phrased in terms of change, and they should be measurable. And that may take some work to translate them into measurable indicators. There really can we think about this in 3 different ways. It can be even changes of learning, changes in action, and changes in condition. And those can be human, economic, civic, or environmental. So organizations with diverse missions and services often share common categories of outcomes. Because outcomes are they're always about change. They're changing something. So for the purposes of our home buying example, a change in learning could be that potential home buyers increase their understanding of the home buying process. It could also be a change in action. Potential home buyers have purchased their first home. It can be changes in condition. Again, human, economic, civic, or environmental. Potential young home buyers have moved from renting to home ownership. You really want to think about who or what will experience the intended changes. You want to think about individual and client-focused outcomes, which reflect the difference the program will make in the lives of those directly served by the program. It can also be family or community outcomes, and those programs intend to create change for families, neighborhoods, whole communities. An example here could be that higher percentage of young homeowners as opposed to renters in a low-income community. That's an intended positive change. There could be systemic outcomes. Those illustrate those changes to overall systems and may include cases where agencies, departments, or complex organizations work in new ways. Where they behave differently, they share resources, or they provide services in a coordinated fashion. And then there's organizational outcomes, and those programs lead to internal outcomes, both individual and institutional, that affect how well a program can achieve external outcomes. And those produce improvements in program management or organizational effectiveness. And those can be increased efficiency, increased staff motivation, increased collaboration with other organizations. So outcomes really, you're thinking about kind of what are the changes that you want to see occur or the difference that is made for the subset of the population you're trying to speak to. So let's talk for a second about the chain of outcomes. Here is the chain of outcomes really transitions us from short-term, intermediate to long-term outcome, because not all outcomes can occur at the same time. Some outcomes must occur before others become possible. So there's the short-term outcomes is what change do you expect to occur either immediately or in the near future. Those are the outcomes that are most direct result of the program's activity and outputs. Those are typically not ends in themselves, but are necessary steps towards the desired end, which are the intermediate or long-term goals. Intermediate outcomes are those changes that you want to occur after that. So those outcomes are the ones that link a program's short-term outcomes to the long-term outcomes. Those are kind of the in-between space. And then there's the long-term outcome. What change do we hope will occur over time? And those are the long-term outcomes that result from the achievement of the short and intermediate-term outcomes. Those are generally also outcomes over which your program has a less direct influence. And often those long-term outcomes will occur beyond the time frame that you identified in your logic model, which is incredibly crucial because that speaks to the notion of sustainability. We really want to make sure that we have a plan for how this is going to affect communities in the future, that this is connected to a deeper, bigger goal. So let's talk for a second about the chain of outcomes. And here's a new example. This is a new kind of example that we're thinking about. And here's a project goal. And this is to improve the oral health of low-income children who receive primary care in a community health center. This is an example taken from some other work that I have not been part of but have seen. So some of the activities can be training, it can be outreach, and those training can be developing curriculum, doing 1-hour didactic trainings to medical professionals in oral health, doing one-on-one trainings to medical providers on oral health. Outreach can be ordering dental supplies, making up packets, and distributing to parents at the end of each visit. So the outputs of that will be training. So number of 2-hour training sessions held, number of medical providers trained. Outreach can be number of parents and children receiving packets, right? So those are the outputs that you're getting from your activities. That's what you've actually done. The short-term outcomes are very different from the long-term outcomes. If you see short-term outcomes, it can be medical providers demonstrate accurate oral health assessment, education, and prevention activities. Long-term outcomes are reduced incidence of cavities in children receiving care from the community health center. The intermediate outcomes, those that are really in between those things, is that more children receive high-quality oral health assessment, right? That's something measurable, education and prevention activities during well-child visits, right? So that's a real in-between space, because ultimately you want to make sure that there are less incidents of cavities. You want oral health to be good in the community, but there have to be steps to get us there. And that change of outcomes is what helps us to understand that. A reasonable level of ambition for an outcome, you really want to think about considering your time frame, considering the scope of your resources and activities, and considering what other factors might influence the achievement of outcomes. So be ambitious, but don't set yourself up for failure. Set yourself up for success. Outcomes versus outputs is something that I would like to spend a little time thinking about, because sometimes outcomes are confused with outputs. Outputs are the direct and measurable products of a program's activity and services. They're often expressed in terms of volume or units delivered. Outcomes, however, are the result or impact of the activities and services. Outcomes often represent the results of multiple outputs. Each outcome usually corresponds to more than one output. So from an output perspective, these are the number of workshops attended by potential first-time homebuyers, right? This is something as a result of your activities, you're seeing an increase in the number of workshops attended by potential first-time homebuyers. But the outcome you're hoping to achieve is that potential homebuyers puts in a contract for a 2-bedroom home, right? You really want to think about kind of what's the difference. One is measurable, one is really the result and impact of the activities and services. What is the value of the logic model process? The value here is that you get the chance to engage stakeholders in a very direct and action-oriented way. It clarifies program theory and helps to fill in gaps. It really helps you to think, what are we trying to achieve? Do we have the resources to achieve it? If not, how do we get them? And what are the activities that we're going to do to actually achieve what we're hoping to do? How are we going to build against our goal? It helps to build local ownership of the program, because what you're doing is through the stakeholder engagement process, through the development of goals that everyone is attached to, measurable goals, defined goals, and an attached agenda to those goals. You're really building local ownership of those programs. You're also building a common understanding about the program, especially about the relationship between action and results. So when your logic model is complete, you really want to take time to revisit it and review your work. You want to consider the following questions. You want to think about, does your organization have adequate resources to implement the activities and achieve the desired outcome? We talked about this in the technical assistance sessions. But really want to think about, if you don't have the adequate resources, who are you partnering with to make sure that you do? Have you included all the major activities that you need to implement your program and to achieve expected outcomes? Would the activities list enable someone who's unfamiliar with your program to understand the scope? Have you expressed your outcomes in terms of change? Have you identified who or what will experience that change and over what time period? Do the activities, outputs, and short and long-term outcomes relate to each other logically through an if-then relationship? Does your logic model clearly identify the scope of your program's influence? And have you considered a variety of perspectives? Right? It's really a good idea here to get feedback from colleagues and stakeholders. You want to think about the logic model as a chance to bring people together around this, and not to set this up as something that sets you apart. Okay? And we're going to really use these logic models to build an evaluation program, but also to build a community of practice around this work. So this is not a one and done thing. This is something that we're going to keep coming back to over the course of the life cycle of this grant. So here is the logic model that was provided in the Notice of Funding Opportunity Supplement. This is a frame. Like, these are the things that have to be included in it, but it can look very different. This can be an Excel spreadsheet. This can be a Word document. This can be a program. However your organization and your partnership chooses to develop this logic model, that's entirely up to you. It doesn't have to be very complicated. This is really the skeleton of what we're looking for. So we're hoping to see that folks have taken the development of this logic model rather seriously and are prepared to talk about it, discuss it, and live with this logic model, and let it be an iterative process to build it together. So this concludes our webinar on developing a logic model. Again, you're more than welcome to contact me directly at amessingmathy@niu.edu. Again, I'm with Education Systems Center at NIU. I'm looking forward to speaking with many of you and to seeing the logic models that come out of this process, and to developing a new type of evaluation structure for the Department of Commerce for some of the work that they're doing. Thank you very much for your time.